For the first time ever, I am thrilled to say we have an official sponsor for the Dirt Talk podcast, and that's Ariat. I've worn Ariat boots on every job site I've visited over the years, traveling in them across 5 continents. More importantly, I have yet to find a single project where working folks, unlike me, are not wearing Ariat boots and workwear in every condition imaginable. And there's really good reason for that, and that's because it's phenomenal stuff. And the more I've learned about Ariat and the company, the more I've loved their brand. So with this, Ariat is offering any Dirt Talk listener 10% off their next Ariat order at ariat.com/dirttalk. That's 10% off boots, jeans, and workwear at ariat.com/dirttalk or at the link in this episode's description. With that, let's get to the show. Welcome back, Monday Dirt Talk podcast. This is the 4th reading from the book Goodfellow, A Century of Grit, Grace, and Goodwill by Alice Skipton, I believe it is. Alice Skipton. Thank you, Alice, for writing such a great book. And thank you, Goodfellow, for being around over a century to be good enough to write about in the first place. If you have not listened to parts 1 to 3, you perhaps could listen to this one without that context, but I would encourage you to go listen to parts 1 through 3. It'll make a lot more sense. I was going to stop after 3. That's kind of a lot from a one book, but I ended on a down note the last time around with their struggles, and then got to the chapters where they're rebuilding and only thought it was appropriate to talk about the rebuilding phase, because I think that's equally as valuable as the downtimes. So without further ado, here we go. After nearly failing, we brought the company back to life. To succeed, we reinforced our 2 biggest strengths, our values and our people. As Steve drove to meet Superintendent Mickey Hewitt at the Skill Village subdivision in Paya in 1985, he had no illusions about the uphill climb in front of him. Still, when he arrived at the job site, he felt hopeful. Those assigned to Goodfellow Brothers' remaining jobs were the best they had: smart, ethical, and hard-working people. He stood with Mickey and said what he would say to all of his superintendents about the work in front of them. The fate of the company is in your hands. Either we make money on this project or we are done. Everybody took it to heart. After starting early and giving their best all day, at quitting time, they would put in 1 extra piece of pipe or 1 extra load of dirt for the boss. In an industry traditionally operating with profit margins in the range of 3%, the dedication of laying an extra 18 feet of pipe a day or dumping an extra 18 cubic yards of earth would make the difference between success and failure. Back in the office, it was the same story, with the estimators and project managers working well into the night. As Dan Reisenauer witnessed when he came for a visit, Steve wasn't asking anyone to do what he also wasn't willing to do himself. Before you pick out a new computer system, you should come to Hawaii and see the operations here, Steve told him. Dan enthusiastically agreed. After his flight, he waited curbside until Steve came to get him. He pulled up in his Chevy Blazer with its shotguns, spent shells, and pizza boxes in the back. The next day, Steve was up at 5 working on bids and making calls as Dan sat observing in the background. It went on like that until dark. By the end of his first day in Hawaii, Dan hadn't talked to anyone or seen a thing except Steve working as fast and as hard as he could. Eventually, they carved out some time for Dan to meet people and get a sense of the work. One evening, they even took the boat out, putting nets in and floating on the water at twilight for the opening day of lobster season. His biggest takeaway, whether in Washington or Hawaii, Steve was a strong leader who worked and played hard and empowered people to do their job, whatever it took. Seeing everyone in action, it was easy to believe that with good communication and hard work, they could take the business to a whole new level. Working in their favor was the fact that Goodfellow Brothers had already been in Hawaii for a decade, putting their values to work and earning goodwill. Steve and his team had built positive relationships with their team on the ground, their clients, and their subcontractors. Without these clients and contractors who knew their character and capabilities, and without the support of the local employees, the community, their day in, day out efforts never would have gained enough traction to get them out of the hole they were currently in. The relationship with Hawaiian Dredging Construction Company was one example. The two companies generally competed for the same work because they had their own civil construction divisions. For that reason, Goodfellow brothers had never teamed up with them on a bid because Steve was worried that once they gave away the prices, their competitor would then underbid them and move forward with their own team. In reality, his fears were unfounded. Goodfellow brothers' continual efforts to perform quality work safely and effectively made them stand out. Their competitor respected their work so much that when they needed extra capacity, Goodfellow brothers was their first stop. Steve took the call. "I'd really appreciate it if you gave us a price to do some civil work," said Hawaiian Dredging's executive Bill Brown. Steve expressed Goodfellow brothers' concerns. In response, Bill said, "I give you my word. If you are the low bidder, you will get the work." Before agreeing, Steve talked it over with Scott Pingree and Jerry McLean. It wasn't just any job. A developer by the name of Chris Hemmeter had plans for 3 mega resorts in Hawaii. The first to be built was the Hyatt Waikoloa. Goodfellow brothers could bid the work with another contractor and potentially get the job. But if they gave their pricing to Hawaiian Dredging and they got underbid, they might lose the work. They decided to take Bill Brown at his word and move forward, focusing on long-term relationships. They all wanted to work with Hawaiian Dredging, the largest building contractor in Hawaii. Even though they hadn't done a job anywhere near this scale on the Big Island, they began to work on the bid. Thanks to their relationships and reputation, they got the initial contract of $10 million for the site work on the Hyatt, with more to come if they completed this phase successfully. Scott and Bud moved to the Big Island to run the job. Their first priority was to maintain a great working relationship with Hawaiian Dredging, who had to complete $300 million worth of work in 14 months, including 1,200 hotel rooms, dolphin ponds, an electric train transportation system, and a Venetian boat canal system to service the massive resort. The project was in a class of its own. The future of Goodfellow brothers hung in the balance. Steve wondered if the company was up to all the unique requirements. Working on their own, Scott as the project civil engineer and Bud as the superintendent, neither man had all the skills or experience they needed to succeed. But together, they made up for each other's weaknesses and showed how a high-functioning team becomes greater than the sum of its parts. Bud reminded Scott of the men he had admired growing up in rural Washington, who had helped build the region's awe-inspiring infrastructure like the hydroelectric dams. Living in camps, those men had dedicated every thought and every moment to the job at hand. With more formal education but less experience, Scott was mesmerized by Bud's ability to impart wisdom with good storytelling about past projects. He just survived the incredibly challenging job in Tonasket under the Bureau of Reclamation. In addition to getting practical advice while drinking beer and sharing a meal after work in their condo near the job site, Scott was confronted by Bud's repeating theme. "We've figured out tough stuff before, and we'll get through this too." Even more impressive to Scott was Bud's impeccable timing and ability to get the most from people, including him. Bud knew who needed checking up on and when to push them, sometimes to the limit. This played out one evening when they were driving around the job site to see if they'd missed anything and caught a crew member siphoning fuel from a fuel tank. As they closed the distance between them, Scott said, "I guess he's gone," thinking Bud would fire him on the spot. But while Bud recognized the severity of the crime, he also understood the man's potential. He got out of the vehicle and calmly approached the man to talk things over. In just a few words, he made it clear that in order to stay, the man had to prove himself and make things right. "From now on, you need to be my best, most loyal, and faithful employee." Experiencing a tough time and having made a poor decision, the man gratefully accepted the second chance and went on to become the employee Bud had imagined him to be. In this way and many others, Bud motivated his crew to move mountains. In the same way Scott learned from Bud, Bud came to admire and respect Scott as he persevered through difficulty after difficulty, figuring out how to engineer the passage for boats and the complex excavation for the dolphin pool, and continually communicating the critical importance of the schedule. Over time, together with the support of Steve, the crew, and the office staff, it all added up to a huge collective accomplishment and a giant step forward for the company. Within 3 years, working with Hawaiian Dredging and the Hemmeter Corporation, both on Kauai and the Big Island, Goodfellow brothers had put in 3 golf courses, miles of offsite infrastructure, and a 2 million gallon lagoon. More importantly, they had laid the groundwork for strong teamwork and furthered the company's reputation among resort developers and general contractors. Success in Hawaii meant more jobs in the Wenatchee office, where the administrative team continued to do accounting and payroll. Leslie L., who started at age 24, had been there nearly a year when Sydney B. applied for a position filling in as Lisa W. from accounts payable went out on maternity leave. After a number of years at the local bank, Cindy answered the ad because she knew of the company's reputation. Her dad had worked for Goodfellow Brothers on construction jobs in Montana and Idaho. She was soon hired. The office manager, Billy Z., taught Cindy, Leslie, and the other employees how an office should be run and at the same time how to uphold the company's values. Born in 1924, Billy Z was a fixture at the company. Just over 5 feet tall with red hair, she was up to most any task in her formal jackets, skirts, and high heels with jewelry to match. When the company's corporate secretary, Mel W., suddenly died in an accident in 1978, Billy was the obvious choice to replace him. It was an important and prestigious position, and she was honored to be asked. Regardless of where she was or what she was doing, she represented the company and considered it both an honor and a responsibility. As Jim Sr. and his wife Ruth got older, she often helped them at home with errands, picking up laundry, a trip to the grocery store, whatever she could do to make life easier and more pleasant for them. After Jim Sr. died, she helped Ruth at the nursing home, taking her treats like her favorite candy, Jordan almonds, with a hard candy shell. Years later, Cindy would support Nancy when Jim Jr. died in 2005, just as Billy had done for Ruth. Cindy and Leslie would both come to treasure all they learned from Billy and her mentoring and training to help them reach their potential. Even as technology changed, she helped maintain ties to their founder and the way he made people feel, like the importance of paying attention to what makes people unique and the power of handwritten notes, personal cards, and timely phone calls. When Cindy started, they all knew the company was struggling financially. That would soon change. At first, Cindy found the accounts payable work manageable, but by July, it was getting harder and harder to complete the work on time. By August, she was taking invoices home to get them coded and ready to get checks out the door. Without any history with the company, she marveled at how fast and good Lisa must have been at her job. When she returned from maternity leave, Cindy said, "I have to hand it to you, you do a lot of work." Lisa said, "No, you are getting double the invoices I ever had." Cindy wasn't the only one working double time. They were all frantic. One day, Scott G. in equipment brought Leslie a clicker for fun so she could track the number of calls coming into the front desk in one day. The phone never stopped ringing. It was a time of rapidly changing communications technology. Years later, they would remember that for a time when managers called in to the Wenatchee office on the CB radio base, Cindy or Leslie would answer KCX 301 base. As Goodfellow Brothers continued to grow, they added offices and ran extension cords between them. By that time, Dan Reisenauer had hired 5 new people. His new hires were mostly young women, and over the next handful of years, they all relied on one another. As one, then another went out on maternity leave. Dan knew that he had the backing of Steve to give his team members support or a helping hand when they needed it. They, in turn, embraced and empowered one another, and Workfellows became family. While celebrating family milestones, they covered for one another and learned how to do everything. It was forced redundancy in a challenging, fun, and engaging work environment, making the team incredibly strong and resilient. Billy would eventually retire in 1997, and Cindy and Leslie regularly went to her house for lunch. They looked forward to her home cooking and visiting with their dear friend, continuing to support her as she got older. Meanwhile, in the late 1980s, the economy in Hawaii had taken off. People began joking about the steel crane overtaking the state bird. Steve no longer had to worry about Goodfellow Brothers paying its bills. Within a handful of years, they'd gone from barely surviving to thriving, from employing less than 30 salaried people to doubling the workforce and more than quadrupling revenue, from having 2 projects to multiple projects on different islands. Thankfully, the company was once more turning a healthy profit. They replaced old equipment with new and invested in every aspect of the business. Around this time, Dan Goodfellow hired a manager to run Morrill Asphalt on the mainland and moved to Hawaii as he could work more closely with his brother and learn the civil side of construction. His wife Claudia joined him, leaving her career and family on the mainland. At the same time, Goodfellow brothers hired people like Ben N., Lane S., Joe C., and Ed B. Originally from Alaska, Ben came on as a cost engineer. From Western Washington, Lane was hired as an estimator. From the Pacific Northwest, Joe started as a cost engineer. And from the East Coast, Ed also started as a cost engineer. In those days, spreadsheets were the precursors to more robust computer programming to come. It wasn't long before Goodfellow Brothers' new generation of leaders were all helping to implement the company's first ever computerized bidding system, operating on a giant PC with only one program, Lotus 123. Uncle Bob's dream realized at last. During a tremendous period of expansion, they faced challenges, solved problems, and grew as people and employees. Ben and Lane both left to try other companies for a time and came back with a greater appreciation for Goodfellow Brothers' special and unique qualities. In later years, Ed would build a successful region on the Big Island. Ben would help start a region in Alaska. Lane would make a business case for more work in Washington, and Joe would build a continuous presence in Oregon. Part of the reason for the locations would be business related, but it also had to do with personal life choices and where the men and their families wanted to live. Goodfellow Brothers cared about their well-being beyond the workplace. They in turn passed that respect onto their team members and crew as their revenue, leadership responsibilities, and the number of people reporting to them grew, creating a powerful feedback loop of commitment and loyalty. Goodfellow Brothers was now thriving and helping to change the industry for the better because of the groundwork being laid in the late 80s and 90s. In addition to Molokai and Maui, they now had offices on the Big Island, Kauai, and Oahu. Without the burden of operations losing money and the distractions of dealing with the problems associated with claims, they built the balance sheet of the company. In 1992, Steve Goodfellow became the company's president and his brother, Dan Goodfellow, its vice president. At the time, Steve appreciated how long hours and the guidance from his dad, his grandfather, and other mentors helped him find his way. He also understood that he'd become the leader the company needed by bringing the best from their past into the future. Steve and Dan worked together to set up the company for more stability, making investments and innovations to extend the company's capacity, such as starting rimrock paving and blasting technology. By building on their core values, they had weathered the toughest storm in the company's history, bringing on leaders of character who would work together to see the company into the next century. Now on to Chapter 7, the right people for the job. For one project in the 1990s, the client had deep concerns about disrupting a sensitive community. From the beginning, our small town, people-centered values made the difference. Their pier needed fixing, the roads were in disrepair, and their runway was a hazard. But in 1991, the project stakeholders and the 60 remaining patient residents of Kalaupapa weren't eager for the disruptions a construction project would bring to their community. They were the last people left of the more than 8,000 children and adults exiled to the isolated north shore of the Hawaiian island of Molokai since 1866 after being diagnosed with Hansen's disease, also known as leprosy. Peace had been a long time in coming. Each one of them had been forced by law to leave friends and family while living with the devastation and disfigurement of the disease. Since ancient times, people the world over had been shunned and stigmatized by this little understood disease. But for Hawaiians, with their culture and identity centered around ohana, the vital role of family and friends to a person's well-being, this law was particularly wrenching. In the beginning, the settlement had little comfort to offer. People were taken there and left to fend for themselves. Over time, caregivers came to offer assistance, and the Hawaiian government allocated resources and built infrastructure, instituting strict rules of conduct between patients and everyone else. Resident couples had to give up their babies and put them up for adoption. Visiting families could see their relatives, but found themselves separated by barriers and unable to hug one another. After decades of unsuccessful medical trials, by the 1940s, researchers discovered an antibiotic that could effectively treat the disease. Drug treatment continued to improve through the 1960s. For those who got treatment, symptoms cleared, and while disfigurement remained, the disease's progression stopped as well as its ability to spread. Eventually, scientists began to understand the disease was less contagious than they'd thought. It came to be known that 95% of people are naturally immune to Hansen's disease. Laws in Hawaii eventually caught up, and people could leave the settlement if they chose, but the stigma and misinformation around the disease continued, making it difficult for people to forge a new life beyond the one they knew. Goodfellow brothers understood that this project presented a unique challenge and opportunity. The company had been founded on tough jobs in remote places. They were used to logistics, which might include barges, airplanes, or helicopters when necessary. More importantly, they knew the power of good relationships and work well done, work which would help the community safely bring in people and supplies, effectively shoring up its lifeline to the larger world. And the paved roads would allow everyone within the settlement, many in wheelchairs, increased mobility. Estimator Lane S. visited first to get the information he needed to bid the job appropriately. Even though Goodfellow brothers had built many jobs on the island of Molokai, he had never been to the settlement before. If you wanted to go to the settlement, you had to get permission, and it wasn't easy to get in and out. 5 square miles of lush flatlands jutted into the ocean against the backdrop of steep cliffs. In relation to the settlement, the rest of Molokai became topside. From the settlement, if you wanted to go topside, you either got on a plane or traversed a steep trail suited for sure-footed mules or mountain goats, assuming the trail wasn't washed out by rains. When he flew in, Lane was struck by both the beauty and isolation. Modern times had bypassed this place, leaving it untouched. After touring the future job areas on land, Lane took a swim, jumping into the clear water to identify boulders that needed to be removed to access the harbor. When the news came in that Goodfellow brothers was selected for the project, neither party knew how lucky they were to have found one another. In fact, Lane felt sick. He wished he could go back in time to those carefree moments in the cleanest tropical waters he'd might ever seen. Instead, his head was swimming. Why was the next highest bid coming in at $4 million more than his $8 million, and another was twice as high at $16 million? He didn't know. He rubbed his forehead and reviewed the numbers again, trying to find a mistake. Now he was just as nervous as the many stakeholders on the project about making this special opportunity successful. Had they accounted for all aspects of the job? Only time would tell, but he knew the project was in the capable hands, and he fervently hoped his bid had set them up for success. As soon as the contract was in place, Goodfellow brothers immediately set to planning. Right away, they came up with a solution for a problematic specification. It said the crew working on the project would live in a camp that could have no contact whatsoever with the settlement. This meant months of total isolation. Goodfellow brothers thought it would be difficult to service the camp, keep it contained, and find people willing to live in such isolation away from family and friends for months on end. But more importantly, suddenly having a new group living nearby would likely disrupt the community, regardless of how careful they were. So they proposed a different solution. Why not use the money in the budget dedicated to the camp to fly people in and out each day? That would ensure the least disruption possible. And if it ended up costing more for Goodfellow brothers, so be it. The client loved the idea. Well before breaking ground, Goodfellow brothers had offered a creative solution at no extra cost, which showed they cared about the needs of the community. The Goodfellow brother team began to come together. Bud Junger, an expert on barging, would manage the comings and goings of supplies and equipment. And Dale Moore would orchestrate people and processes. Dan Goodfellow was there as the paving expert. Like his brother, Dan had started out as a laborer, later joining the operators union, and then worked his way up the company to become president of Morrill Asphalt on the mainland. At the settlement, he looked forward to learning more about civil construction alongside Dale, just as Steve had. The craftspeople would implement step by step all the changes the community wanted and needed. And this would all be done according to the specifications of zero disruption or interaction with the community. Wenatchee-based Scott G. would be helping Bud and Dale with equipment logistics. In June of 1991, on his first day flying into the settlement, he wasn't sure he was going to live to see another day. The runway was full of axis deer, a non-native species gifted to the Hawaiian king in the 1860s from Hong Kong and brought to Molokai. The small plane nearly crashed and had to pull up and go around again before landing successfully. Every flight in after that required an initial buzz to startle the deer out of the way. An additional worry was the angle of the wind and the adjacent cliffs, the cause of accidents and the reason they were realigning the runway. Scott also had to contend with being the only outsider on the crew. Most everyone on Dale's team was from Molokai, a talented, tight-knit group that had grown up together and who also had relatives among the community. Scott had to earn his way in. One of the specifications included leaving no trace and required the crew to use a toilet that burned the waste. When the 220-volt toilet that Scott had ordered arrived, the crew was afraid to use it. They tried to get Scott to go first. He didn't go first, but ultimately won them over with his friendly and straightforward manner and obvious concern for their welfare. For instance, he'd packed sleeping bags and cots into the office trailer in case they got stranded. That happened only a few weeks into the project. A storm hit and nobody could come or go. In addition to the beds, people from the settlement came and asked them if they needed anything, offering up dry clothes. Then they threw a party in a makeshift shelter. They were all starting to feel a little bit more at home with one another. But up to this point, per the strict rules of the contract, most of the interactions were with those employed in the community rather than the residents. That would soon change. Fixing the pier came first so it would be safe and have the capacity to handle the offloading of heavy equipment and supplies for the work on the runway and the roads. But how to fix the pier before you can get equipment and supplies there? Imagine living in a small, quiet community, and suddenly you have the spectacle of helicopters helping with precision construction, dropping buckets of concrete into forms 1 yard at a time. From the moment the work began, the residents drifted closer to watch what would happen next. Once the team completed the harbor and pier work, Bud's barge trips became another one of the attractions. The settlement went from 2 barges a year to a daily docking. All supplies had to arrive during the summer before the weather made the trip too dangerous. Prior to starting the job, Bud spoke with Jim Jr., who said, "I don't care how much money you've got in the budget for mobilization. You are going to do it safely." Bud was in a race to log 100 sea miles every 24 hours for 50 days straight. If the barging got off track, the timing and budget of the rest of the work would be its own style of shipwreck. Bud kept things on track while playing as hard as he worked. He fished as much as possible on and offshore and quickly came to know and love this place and the people cheering him on. Over time, local rigs began to line the road by the pier so residents could get closer to the action. Goodfellow brothers made it easier for the residents to satisfy their curiosity by setting up a viewing area where people could gather and watch. As it happened, this group liked to gamble, and they soon saw the perfect chance for a wager. When trucks began running gravel, operator Carl M. had the unfortunate habit of forgetting to lock his tailgate after dumping his load, so the most observant residents bet he'd dribble the most gravel after picking up a new load and heading up the ramp. Dale upped the ante by handing out stopwatches so they would have more to speculate on, with the side benefit of friendly competition improving his team's performance. "Watch out for that red truck," someone would call out to Dale, "or the guy over there has moved fewer loads than the other guy." It wasn't long before the owner of the residence bar and store, Mariano Rey, approached Goodfellow brothers, wondering why none of the crew ever came into his establishment. Sent to the settlement as a young man in 1937, Mariano had an entrepreneurial spirit, and with the money his store earned over the years, he had helped over a dozen relatives back in the Philippines attend and finish college. He'd seen the upcoming construction as an opportunity and stocked up on beer and merchandise, expecting lots of customers. Dale told him the contract didn't allow it, and they were asked to stay away. The two agreed. At this point, now that they knew one another, the rule no longer made sense. So Goodfellow brothers got permission to ignore that stipulation. But they were still careful. The supply barge only came twice a year, so Dale made it clear to his crew they could support the store and bar, but they would not do so in a way that would deplete the community's supplies. It was a highlight in the crew's day to have a beer and listen to Mariano's stories as they sat outside at the picnic table of his tiny establishment. As the work moved forward on schedule, the runway project proved just as interesting to the residents. The old runway had to be blasted out of the way, dynamite coming on the plane by itself, and the work had to go in phases to keep planes coming in and out. By widening and reorienting the runway by 5 degrees, it would be safer for airplanes to take off and land in relation to the crosswinds. The last phase of the work, the resurfacing of more than 7 miles of roads, brought the construction into the heart of the community and would have a tremendous impact on people's ability to get around, including many who used wheelchairs. That's when a crisis struck. One of the community's beloved cats was run over and killed. In a place where children weren't allowed, dozens of somewhat feral cats were named, fed, and loved like family as they lounged around, fought one another, and went after the geckos. Losing one of these dotted-on animals was bad enough, but even worse, nobody had seen the accident and nobody was admitting they'd done it. Tensions began to rise, and the community wondered if the new contractor might be the villain responsible. Everyone on Dale's team fervently denied doing it. He knew this loss had struck the community hard, and regardless of who was to blame, they needed to find a way forward. He prepared to halt the work and to try to work it out. Seeing their newfound friends struggling to make things right proved to be too much for somebody's conscience. One of the residents finally fessed up, and the tensions evaporated. It was possible the cat had been hit because of somebody's poor eyesight. Losing vision was one of the many hardships of Hansen's disease. It was one of the reasons that when Dan Goodfellow first arrived, the county sheriff leaned in conspiratorially as he drove him from the airport into the town and told him to watch out for the mailman. The mailman was a beloved friend and mentor to many. As a child in 1939, he was taken from his family and sent to the hospital on the island of Oahu before being sent to the settlement. When you see the dust coming, Richard told Dan, get out of the way. It was good advice. In other places, having only a fraction of his eyesight left, a mailman might not have been able to drive. But in the settlement, people made allowances, kept their sense of humor, and accepted and loved people as they were. That was the approach Goodfellow Brothers' crew took when Aaron was on his daily route one day. He made his usual speedy run to the airport to get the mail, but when he went to back up, he crashed into the Goodfellow Brothers company plane that brought the crew in and out each day. No matter, no one got hurt, and the plane could be fixed. The crew there that day assured him all was well and waved him on his way, laughing to once again see the dust cloud billowing up in his wake. At this point, it was too late to worry that paved roads might be more dangerous because of a lack of dust to warn people of oncoming traffic. A lot went into those surfaces being smooth and passing inspection. A tiny drum mixer asphalt plant was purchased that produced 65 tons per hour and would be used by Goodfellow Brothers on Molokai for years after. Liquid asphalt bladders had to be hauled and stored and then heated up when it was time to mix it with the crushed rock. For the rocks themselves, maintaining the right gradations throughout the moves from Maui to the barge to the construction site required care and precision. That kind of careful and trained eye couldn't help but also notice the rundown tennis court. The tennis courts had been on Dan Goodfellow's mental checklist almost from day one. As the project progressed, it was extremely satisfying to finally get to them, to have the equipment and know-how to simply make them new again as a gift to the community. Compared to the rest of the work, it didn't take much time at all to resurface and restripe the small area. Installing new nets and donating new rackets meant the courts could be put to use immediately. Between smooth roads and the tennis courts, the staff members now had a few more options for recreation when they weren't caring for the patients. One of the nurses told Dan, "Now I can get my roller skates out again." They had been put away for some time due to the poor condition of the roads. As the work neared completion, Dan and Dale wondered what else they could do for these people who had welcomed them and embraced them. Of course, they would have a ribbon cutting ceremony, but Goodfellow brothers wanted to do more. The state recommended that they do something Hawaiian, like a luau or barbecue, maybe a pig cooked in the traditional Kahlua style. But Goodfellow brothers didn't want to make assumptions. This community continually surprised them. What Goodfellow brothers or the state suggested might not be what the residents would want. They approached the community with a few ideas, then they asked them what would be best. Then they asked them, "What would you like best?" The overwhelming response? Fast food. Domino's Pizza, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Burger King. They were adamant and very excited. Fast food was one thing that never arrived on their shores. As he planned to fly in bucketfuls and bags of fast food, Dan also reached out to an artist to commission a painting to leave as a parting gift. He asked the community what they might want to have painted. The cliffs, maybe? No, we see that every day. We want a painting of what you all are doing here. So artist Nina Valley came and painted the mountains of Kalaupapa, which is what the residents called the well-organized heaps of materials in the Goodfellow brothers' staging yard. On August 19th, 1992, when the day of the party arrived and after the wheelchair races on the runway had run their course, Steve and Dan Goodfellow stood in the community center handing out burgers, fried chicken, and pizza to the residents. Lane was there too, with a sense of extreme well-being that his bid work early on in the project had been accurate, despite coming in so much lower than their competitors. The project had been a good fit and financially very successful for Goodfellow brothers, just as they'd thought in the beginning, for reasons that went beyond their bidding and construction know-how. When Kenso S. came through the line, he handed Steve and Dan gifts saying, "I bet you can't guess what these are." Each of the two objects was about 4 inches long, a flattened copper pipe attached to a wood handle, an item Kenso invented and carved to help residents more easily use their hands to open a soda or beer can. "You know, this is my business," Kenzo told Dan and Steve proudly. "I've made 12 of them this year." He'd carved his name into the gift to remember him by. He'd been at the settlement since 1928, where he had endured, survived, and then made a significant difference in caring for and mentoring the people in his community. It was a gift to be treasured, representative of friendship and qualities to be admired, like good humor, tremendous strength, and adaptability. When it was time to leave, Goodfellow brothers offered whatever vehicles might be useful to the community, but left no trace of the construction materials from the mountains of the settlement, unless people requested something they could use. The painting was hung in the community office, and the image would also appear around town on silkscreen t-shirts distributed at the end of the project and worn by residents and Goodfellow crew members. In a place with such significant history and such time-worn and admirable people, Goodfellow brothers did what they knew how to do. They supported the infrastructure of the community. But more than that, in one of the most isolated locations in the world, on a project where they weren't supposed to connect with residents at all, they succeeded by putting all of their values into action, like earning trust, making friends, and leaving the community better than they found it. And that is where I will conclude the Goodfellow series, 4-part series on Goodfellow brothers. They're over a century in business. It's an amazing story. I've been very fortunate to speak with Dan Goodfellow, or Steve Goodfellow, and of course, Chad Goodfellow. The Goodfellows are some of the best people I've ever met in the industry, and their leadership is top-notch. Operations are top-notch. Companies top-notch. So if you're looking for a great company to go to work for in Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, or Northern California, I could not recommend Goodfellow Brothers enough. They would be a company I would be happy to work for. And you can look them up by searching Goodfellow Brothers on the internet. So with that, if you have any other stories you would like me to read, if you have books, an extra book, cool book, send them our way, please. But write us nonetheless, dirttalk@buildwit.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. Stay dirty.